slide, please. Okay, so here we are, rounding out the first half hour, where I've kind of introduced you to some ideas. We're about to go in with our colleagues from Waymo. Yep, I can see that there. Thanks, Stephanie. Any questions in the Slack or anything in the next 2 or 3 minutes before we roll into that? Michael and his 110 baud modem. Oh man, did you keep it? Frank, yes, we can get to presentation materials, you bet. All right, if there are no more questions, I'm kind of inclined. I see my colleague from Waymo, Stacy, here. Hello there, Stacy. I'm kind of inclined to hand the baton over to you. I know what you've got for us is going to be incredibly thought-provocative and really, really interesting. I'd love to have some conversation in the chat as you speak. So if you don't mind, I'm going to hand the baton right over to you.
Sure, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yep, you sound great. I'll let you do your own introduction, and we'll just take it away.
So my name is Stacy James. I am the head of cybersecurity from Waymo. I'm here with one of my colleagues, Gabe Drucker, who's privacy counsel. He'll be up in a minute. What I don't see are the controls for the slides. So I don't know how to. Oh, okay. That looks like they're going to advance it for me. So let me bring up another version here so I can. So next slide, please. Thank you. So a little bit about Waymo first to start. At Waymo, we're building the world's most experienced driver. We're making a fully autonomous driving system for transportation and the transportation of people and goods. I know most people think of Waymo as building autonomous cars. It's not actually what we do. And I know it sounds like semantics to say we're actually building a driver for a vehicle, because even if you look in the greater Phoenix metro area, you'll see that we have Chrysler Pacifica minivans and Jaguar I-Paces being driven by different versions of the Waymo driver. And we also have them on Daimler Cascadia Class 8 trucks. So we build a driver that can drive multiple vehicles, and said our goal is to build the world's most experienced driver. Next slide. So at Waymo, safety is our foundation. So this conference is about trust. Trust is one of those things that's kind of like respect. It's very hard to earn. It's very easy to lose, and you can't ask for it. The only way that you're going to end up getting trust or respect is that you earn it. So at Waymo, safety is our foundation. It's central to everything we do. Our safety program is as innovative and rigorous as the development of the product itself. And I know you're probably thinking, okay, I thought we were talking about security, but I want to show how those two relate. So let's go to the next slide. So this is an image. So this is a real scenario. This is one of our Pacifica minivans. This scenario is from Chandler. The vehicle is, or the Waymo driver is in fully autonomous mode. So there's no safety, there's no human safety driver in the front seat. And in this scenario, so the screen at the bottom is is the front-facing cameras from the cars. The top is how we visualize it inside. And you can see that the Waymo driver is proceeding normally through a green light. It detects that a vehicle is going to run the red coming from the right, and it acts appropriately. It slows down, lets that vehicle proceed because it doesn't want to get hit. If you look at the top screen, you can actually see how quickly or how soon the Waymo driver figures it out. It throws up that red barrier, thinking that car's not going to stop. Then it drops it thinking maybe it will. Then it throws it back up going, no, it won't, and comes to a safe stop. So as a Waymo customer, you want to be able to have trust that not only are you going to be in a vehicle that drives safely, drives smoothly and all that, but it's also a vehicle that drives defensively, that can take into consideration the mistakes of others, right? We're all taught to drive defensively when we drive, so the Waymo driver is taught the same thing. So if we go to the next slide. So this one's from San Francisco. This is our new I-Pace with the 5th generation Waymo driver. And it's not just customers that we need to get trust from. It's also everybody else around us. You can see from the top image how the car can see all the pedestrians and all this kind of stuff. But the other thing is that, let's say your daily hobby is to bicycle the wrong way down traffic and be occluded by parked cars, the thing is, you want to ensure that if a car coming around the corner, that it sees you early, it responds properly, and gives you the space to go about doing whatever you were doing. You probably should have been on the right side of the road, but in this case, the person wasn't, but we let them safely go by. So again, this vehicle is in fully autonomous mode. There's no human in the driver's seat of the vehicle, and the Waymo system can see the pedestrian or see the cyclist from a long way off when they come up from behind the van and acts accordingly. So this is the output of what our safety program creates. This ability to not only drive safely, but drive defensively and take into consideration all the things that are going on around it. So if we go to the next slide, the role of security is that it's our primary role to protect the integrity of the output of that safety program. So what that really means, like the security team does a lot of things. Obviously we protect privacy data, we protect against ransomware, we protect against loss of intellectual property and financial loss and all this kind of stuff. But our primary role is to ensure that what the safety program produces stays the way it was designed to stay, so that someone doesn't maliciously interact with part of the system and cause it to do something it was not designed to do, that it always stays the way it was designed. So the day it rolls at the door, 3 months later, 3 years later, it's the way it was designed. So next slide. So I'm going to take you on a little bit of a trip about how this comes, like background of automotive and other types of cybersecurity, and the complexity that goes into a system like this. So traditional automotive security, like let's go back to the ancient days of the late 90s. This was what automotive security really was. It was, you lock the doors, you put up the window. The real security concerns about cars at the time were car theft. So as long as the car was locked, the car was considered secure. There was other things like steering wheel locks and all those kind of things, but the reality was all the security was on the outside of the vehicle, the steel shell, and inside of the vehicle, assumed if you're inside, then you're probably supposed to be there. So next slide. What ended up happening was we ended up starting hooking things to the internet, right? Obviously, everybody wants to be able to turn on their microwave from Cleveland or whatever this is trying to achieve. But when we started hooking things to the internet, we start giving a different type of access to basic things that already existed, whether or not it's microwaves and refrigerators or automobiles. And then that created this effect where the access type to the thing that you own had completely changed from you need to be physically touching it to you needed to have some kind of internet connectivity to it. So next slide. So what could go wrong if that happens? In the basic case, if we think about like IoT devices and stuff like that, your fridge or your TV, we saw researchers hacking both of these. Now, what's the worst case scenario if someone hacks your TV or your fridge? Oh, maybe they can turn your fridge off and the food goes bad. So for this one, I'm going to hit next a few times. So just hit next again. Or they can use your refrigerator to steal your email. They can use that to break into your business. 3 guys in a college dorm decided to create the world's largest botnet using vulnerable internet-facing IoT cameras to run a Minecraft scam, and then it got away from them, and they brought down large chunks of the internet worldwide. So that happened in 2016. They had the FBI and everybody after them. It was a big deal. But if you look at this last one that came up, if you want to talk about trust, imagine being a young parent and you have a baby monitor in your room because in your child's room because you're trying to keep an eye on your child. And then you realize not only can you interact with your child and see your child through this monitor, but people on the internet can. And not only can they are. There was multiple cases where strangers from the internet were interacting with children, everything from babies to toddlers who could actually talk back. They're interacting with these children and looking at these children in their rooms because these devices, originally not designed for internet connectivity, received internet connectivity, but weren't secured against what could go wrong. So if we hit next, and then one more. There we go. So what happens when we do the same thing with cars? In the automotive industry, cars started becoming more and more complicated. Although when we get into a car, it's still steering wheel and pedals and seats. The reality is underneath, inside the vehicle, it became more and more and more of a server network or a computer network. It can have up to 100 computers in it. There are multiple different kinds of networks in the car, but they were all designed with the premise that if the doors are locked, the car is secure. So when the car got hooked to the internet, what we found is in 2015, two researchers were able to come in through an internet connection in a Jeep. Now they owned the Jeep, and the reporter in this case was in on it, so they knew what was going on, but they had not modified the Jeep in any way. They came in through an internet connection to the Jeep. They were able to make some changes that they should not have been able to make. They jumped to a network that's called what's basically thought of what's called motion control, the network in the vehicle that the steering and the brakes and the throttle are on. So that's able to affect the vehicle's speed and direction. They got onto that network, and then they were able to influence the signals on that network so that not only was the steering wheel and the pedals controlling the vehicle, they were actually able to have motion control effect from an internet connection. So if you go to the next slide, that caused this. So this is the Jeep in question, and what they were able to do in this particular case, like no one got hurt, it damaged a little bit of grass. So if you hit next, and it also caused this. It caused a 1.4 million vehicle recall in basically early 2016, 2015. So basically Jeep had to bring these vehicles, had to fix all these vehicles. What came from that is, so you just hit next a few more times, was this series of events. Tesla, BMW, hit next again. Progressive insurance dongles, right? They said, oh, stick this in your car and we'll track your insurance, or we'll let someone, hack your car. Other kinds of dongles be plugged into basic cars. Hit next again. Nissan Leaf, someone was able to turn on all the air conditioners of all the Leafs on the planet through the internet. He didn't actually do it. He only did it to his own, but he figured out, it's like, okay, if I write this little script, I can drain the battery of every Nissan Leaf on the planet. People were able to figure out how to influence Mercedes-Benz. Next. Ford and Volkswagen got in on it, and next. And then Toyota, Lexus were also vulnerable. So this created a scenario where all of these manufacturers had this car with legacy networks that were designed around old security principles, but now they had new security problems. And this completely changed. You can see a lot of these dates are the same, right? They come all the way up to 2020, but a lot of the dates were 2015, 2016, 2017, as security researchers started going through these different vehicles. And it completely changed the automotive industry and what cybersecurity meant in the automotive industry. It was no longer just, well, we got to protect obviously our infrastructure in the back end and our customer data and stuff like that. Now it's the vehicle itself is a product and it's on the road, and we designed it in a certain way. And we need to make sure that malicious actors are not able to affect these vehicles in that certain way. So the next slide. So the industry had a problem, and Yoda was sad. So all of a sudden, everything changed. So next slide. So I'm gonna talk about a few things around some basics of how small changes can have big effects. So when I first got into security in the 90s, one of the things that got me interested in security was learning how to steal cars. Now, I didn't actually steal a car. I was trying to protect the car that I had just bought. And you don't really understand, you don't truly know how to protect something unless you also know how to break into it, right? You don't know how to protect a car from being stolen unless you also know how to steal a car. So anyway, that's my kind of view of security. So in this particular case, if we look at how keys changed over time with vehicles, first it was just a steel key, you put the key into the door, you unlock the door, you put the key into ignition, you drive away. Then automotive manufacturers started adding key fobs. And the key fob had an unlock button, the lights would chirp on your car, maybe your car would make a little sound, and your doors would unlock. But the other thing your car would do when you did that is, actually just go back to the previous slide. The other thing your car would do when you did that is it would tell the immobilizer, which is a computer in the car, that this car is now allowed to drive. So if you went over and the car was still armed and you stuck a key in the ignition or you opened the door, the alarm would go off and the immobilizer wouldn't let the car start. So you'd press a button on the key fob, the car would say, I'm going to go from you're not allowed to drive mode to you are allowed to drive mode. Then you'd stick your key in the ignition and then you'd turn the key. So you did a physical thing and then you did a kind of an electronic thing, right? So it's kind of like two-factor authentication that kind of came up before, right? There's an electronic component and a physical component. A few years ago, I guess about 7, 8 years ago now, manufacturers started adding a start button to the car and created a technology called remote keyless entry. Now, the difference with remote keyless entry is that the key fob is, you can now keep it in your pocket. You don't have to press the button to unlock the car, and you don't have to put the key in the ignition. So what ends up happening is if you're close to the car, you can unlock and get in. And if you're far away from the car, somebody else can't unlock it and get in. Now with the old key fobs, they encrypted the signal so someone can't grab it and play it themselves. And they put in a anti-replay thing so someone can't grab the encrypted signal and just replay the encrypted signal. So they put that technology into the new key fob. The signal is encrypted, it's authenticated, it's got anti-replay. But what they had done is they had removed the act of physically touching something. And the other thing that they had changed was originally the interaction with the car started by pressing the fob button. So whoever had the key started the interaction. But now as you touch the car, actually just back up to the previous slide. So now you go up and you touch the car, right? And the car starts the transaction. So before it was the key was, hey, car, unlock. And now it's, hey, key, are you there? Can I unlock? It fundamentally changed the conversation between the key and the car. But the technology, the security technology in the key fob basically remained the same. So now if we go to the next slide. So although we had all of the encryption stuff and authentication stuff and anti-replay stuff, that's all great. But what we ended up with was the primary security component of the key became proximity. Before you need to physically touch and the key started the transaction, now you just need to be close and the car starts the transaction. So can attackers overcome this proximity problem? Next slide. They do it using the way we all do it. Basically, if two people are too far apart to talk to each other, they use an electronic device between the two of them to communicate, whether it's a telephone or texting or whatever it is. Kind of like right now, I'm in California, you're in Arizona, and we're talking by transmitting a signal. So what attackers realized was if they put a transceiver next to the key and another one next to the car, the key and the car can be very far apart. And when someone touches the car and says, hey, key, are you there? The transceiver amplifies that and throws it to the other one. The key responds. Then all of a sudden, the key can be very far from the car, and the car will still think the key is right next to it. So if we go to the next slide, and I don't know if you can play that video or not. It doesn't have a play button on it. There we go. So this is someone's home camera. And if you watch, what ends up happening is a couple of people get out of this car that pulls up, and that one will walk up to this Mercedes and the other one will walk up to the house. So there's two things that are going on here. One is, if you look, each one of them has a black box in their hand, one either side of this transceiver, and a little bit of basically human patterns. When people typically go home, if they park in the driveway, they go into the front door, so they don't lose their keys, they stick it on a little hook or they put it in a little bowl on a little table or something like that. But the key is close to the front of the house, which means that the transceiver that the guy walked up to the house with can talk to the key and the other one can talk to the car. So first guy's walking away, I guess he's resetting something, but person A is now in the car. He's going to walk back up. He's going to reestablish connection with the key inside of the house, and you're going to see this car start. So this became a popular way to steal cars over the last 4 or 5 years. And automotive manufacturers struggled to adapt to it because it was hardware. Like they couldn't issue everybody new fobs. I mean, these guys aren't rocket scientists, right? They blocked in the car they were trying to steal with the car they brought with them, right? You know, they could have saved a few seconds there, but apparently they weren't in that big of a rush. So we had gone from anti-theft security getting better and better and better to anti-theft security actually getting a little bit worse, simply because although we had a key fob and a car, and they were both have been encrypted and authenticated signal with anti-replay, the fundamental principle of how the two work had changed simply because they added this proximity mode. So if we go to the next slide, it gets a little bit more complicated with newer cars. So not only did we say, okay, let's add an internet connection to a car that has an old legacy network, and not only did we change how keys interact with cars, But now we're putting features on cars, like street cars that you can buy, that driver assist systems. So I'm going to show a couple of examples here of how people have been playing with driver assist systems. Now, none of these work on a Waymo vehicle. Waymo vehicles are way more sophisticated than this. But what they're trying to do is they're now looking at confusing the ML systems that are being used in automotive vision systems. And this is important because the way the security industry really works is people put in mitigations, then researchers do more research, right? And it's just constant kind of cat and mouse game of pushing things forward. So in this particular scenario, you have a stop sign, the vision system. Now, this is just a pretty basic vision system that's ML based. The vision system looks at the sign and says, that's a stop sign. They add a few strategic stickers based on what they understand of the vision system. And that vision system says, that's a 45-mile-per-hour speed limit sign. Now, that's a fundamental difference. It's a fundamental difference if the car actually made a decision based on that. Now, there's a lot that goes into like these driver assist systems shouldn't look at a sign and go, you know what, I really think this should have been a stop sign, but it says 45 miles per hour, so I'm going to hit it. I mean, you know, that's not how the system's really designed. But it does show that adversarial attacks on ML systems can actually be fairly simple. Like I said, real professional systems like the one Waymo has wouldn't fall for something like this because these may not be stickers. They could be leaves of a tree that are right next to the stop sign, right? You can't have a system that, oh, the stop sign has to be perfect for me to read it. So like my particular street car, my personal car, can read road signs, but it just puts the speed limit sign up on the instrument cluster. It doesn't actually do anything with it. So if we go to the next slide, in this one, this is the vision system of an actual car. It is for lane keeping. So, you know, if you have the driver assist systems and you turn on the lane keeping, it sees the lines on the road and can tell you if you're getting too close to a line, or can actually steer. Some of the systems will steer. So in this particular car, the system steered. And what the researchers were trying to do is they were trying to see how much damage they had to do to the road line before the car finally couldn't see it anymore. But the engineers of this system had actually done a lot of work, because a lot of systems, even one of the car that I have, if the line is like kind of broken up because it's close to the side of the road or whatever, the system won't really detect that the line is there. It'll lose it. So the engineers for this particular vehicle, what they had put a lot of energy into being able to figure out where the line is, even when the line is not fully intact, right? And it was a feature. So that way, when they're driving on like back roads and stuff like that, the car can still figure it out. So the attackers used that against them. So they took a part of the roadway. In this case, they used an intersection because there was no other competing lines to have to deal with. And they put 3 stickers on the road. I've circled 2 of them. The other one I couldn't actually see in the image, but they put 3 stickers on the road, and they put those at an angle to the actual lane. And to a human, you may see 2 dots, but you're really not going to, you know, draw any conclusions. The vision system saw those few dots, said, that's a line, that's the road line, I'm going to follow it. And the car actually switched lanes. Now, both lanes were in the same direction. This was researchers doing it. There was nobody else around, and it didn't go into oncoming traffic. So it wasn't really like, it got reported a little bit different than it actually happened. But what it did show is that as we start adding these types of intelligence systems to cars, the data that these systems bring in is no different than malicious data that, like when the Jeep got hacked, malicious data came over the internet. When these things are being influenced, malicious data is coming in through the vision system. So we have to take all of these things into account when we're you know, looking at these systems. It can't just be, oh, we're looking at internet data. What we're doing is we're looking at all kinds of data. How could someone fool the system? How could someone trick the system? How could someone lie to the system to make the system do something it wasn't intended to do? So if we go to the next slide. So protecting against malicious data is actually a lot of what we do. Whether that malicious data is trying to put malware on a system, whether that malicious data is trying to trick a system into doing something that's wrong, whether that malicious data is actually on the base vehicle CAN bus, which is the primary driver control bus, and is basically saying, you know, I know the human driver is holding the steering wheel straight, but, you know, go left. So a lot of what we do is actually protect against malicious data in all different forms, the way the malicious data can show up, whether it's through vision systems or internet connections or network to network. So if we go to the next slide, what we're really dealing with is we're dealing with a vehicle that has a series of networks. We're dealing with the Waymo driver that has a series of networks. Then we're dealing with Waymo services and servers that are a network. So we have a network on top of a network on top of a network. These are different types of networks. They use different types of protocols. Some of them are wireless, most of them are wired. Some of them are off-board, some of them are on-board. Some can use big servers, some use little embedded ECUs. So, and this is just the system that we have, right? For us, even with all of this, we own it, we design it, we test it, we pen test it. Even with all of that, we also assume that things can go wrong. So you can't just design for the success case. You have the design for the failure case. What happens if this part goes wrong? What happens if this part gets compromised? What happens if this part goes wrong? And you have to design a system that maintains a safe state, even if one part of the system can get compromised or something like that. So one of the primary things we do is our vehicles are always responsible for the driving. So if some offboard server, if somebody compromised an offboard server and sent the vehicle a message and say, do this thing, the vehicle will go, I have all the situational awareness. I'm not doing that thing. I know what I'm supposed to do. So you also have, we can't just design for the success case. We also have to design for failure cases. And I said, and this is a scenario where we own all the data. Like one of the things I tell my kids is, don't take data from strangers, right? And although it's a kind of a play on an old term, it's true, right? Don't click on links that you get. Don't, there's so much phishing and all this kind of stuff that goes on. It's bad actors trying to send you bad data, and you don't want to take that data from strangers. So if we go to the next slide, this is some of the future. This kind of represents some of the futures that people are talking about. So this is a post I grabbed from somebody's blog, but really what they're talking about, kind of the next stage that we see a lot of conversations around, is data from strangers, right? Whether or not you want to call it smart city or you want to call it vehicle to infrastructure or whatever, it's the concept that cars will talk to infrastructure and talk to mobile phones. And I don't mean the way like you get in a car and your car can Bluetooth to your phone. I mean like cars will use location data from other people's phones to figure out where pedestrians are. Cars will talk to other cars. Cars will talk to your home. Cars will talk to cellular networks and all this kind of stuff. That's a lot of data from a lot of strangers. And it comes down fundamentally to trust, because a system like this, although this right now is just a lot of prototyping and pilots, smart city systems or big complicated, multi-dimensional systems like that would require not only a lot of trust, and I don't mean that it's like, oh, I trust that other computer because it has a certificate. I mean, I understand that if that computer went wrong, that it couldn't fundamentally harm me because I don't own it. Somebody else owns it. Somebody else tampered with it. Somebody stole a credential off another computer and stuck it on the network, and they were able to do something bad. So whether or not you're in policy or you're in computer science, or you're doing machine learning, or you're doing cybersecurity, or you're doing privacy, because if you also think about this thing, and Gabe will come up in a minute to talk about it, is there's a lot of privacy data flying around in here. There's a lot of control data flying around in here. There's a lot of everything data flying around in these kinds of scenarios. So, and this is, like I said, right now, there's just a lot of conversations in pilots, but depending on what you do when you come out of school, this will be one of the problems that you're faced with. How do you do this and keep it safe and keep people's data private and keep people's data secure, and make sure that failed parts of the system don't negatively interfere with other parts of the system, right? You don't want your toaster holding you ransom just the same way you don't want the traffic light holding you ransom. So anyway, if we go to the next slide, I'll hand off to Gabe, our privacy counsel, and he can go in a bit about privacy. But that's the security view from Waymo.
Thanks, Stacy. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Gabe Rucker. I am a privacy attorney here at Waymo. And unfortunately, my presentation features fewer car thefts, but it looks to be fun. I'm a former litigator. Before working at Waymo, I've worked at Yahoo and then EA Gaming, and came here about 3 years ago. And I'll be talking about just a brief background and history of privacy in the AV space, and then a discussion of where we're going, what are the next steps. Go next slide. It's not the slide I have. Oh, well. Well, moving on to this slide, I think it's this slide talks about how US adults perceive privacy. This is from a 2019 study, and I think it generally reflects pretty close alignment with how both commercial industries and the international regulations define privacy. You see a discussion that a lot of people are keen up on some of the key themes that we're talking about: other people and organizations not being able to access their data, control over their information, deciding what is accessible, the idea of control and deciding, and then that personal information and possessions, that there's a desire to keep things to themselves. So we see these themes that people are pretty attuned to the ideas of privacy, kind of these fundamental concepts that have been around for over 100 years that we really see reflected in laws and in the industry spaces, or at least what they're striving to do. So keep going, next slide. The question becomes, what is, how do we define this? Like, well, how is this defined anyway? And the definition that I like to refer to is respecting people's agency and interests when handling information about them. It's a useful definition, but it's much more complex than that. Privacy is sort of this amorphous concept. It's almost like defining liberty or freedom. It is a lot of things to a lot of different people, and it can have a lot of different contributing causes to it. So we know it's more than that. We know it's more than just a subset of security or even secrecy. We know that privacy helps define people's identities. For instance, if the government, if it's listening to people or someone's listening to you, we know it affects what people say. Will they experiment with new ideas? Usually they won't, or controversial ideas that might be out of favor. You can think of a lot of movements that might have been suppressed or were suppressed by a lack of privacy, from civil rights to gay rights to Black Lives Matter to movements that we see today. So privacy definitely affects this flow of ideas, experimentation with ideas that might be out of favor in the moment, but might be viewed later as a collective good. So it's really important in this aspect. It's also important to see privacy as a collective versus an individual concern. So I say this, what I mean is that a lot of people, when I tell people what I do, they say, well, I have nothing to hide. Why is privacy important to me? So first of all, I usually look slanty-eyed at that and kind of call BS on that. But even if I was to accept that at face value, that someone had absolutely nothing to hide between their personal life, their medical history, professional life, privacy is still important. It's still something that they need to maintain because individual privacy is directly linked with the community, and especially with marginalized and disadvantaged groups. So for an example, if a small group of people, or let's say the entire public minus 5% of the public was willing to just allow the state, federal, local government to go through their phone records for the past 10 years, go through it, do whatever you want. But only 5% of people said, no, I'm not comfortable with that. Even if that 5% of people were not doing anything wrong, illegal, problematic, they obviously come under more scrutiny. And that's a way to generally think about privacy. By protecting your own privacy, you're actually protecting it for marginalized groups, for other people who may be discussing or considering these ideas that may be not illegal, but on the fringe, that are pushing the borders of things. So that's why we see it as a collective concern. As a company, privacy is also one of the clearest ways to build trust. Numerous studies have shown that when a customer trusts you with their data, it will create a halo effect for the product. If they think, this phone protects my privacy especially well, it will have a halo effect over features of the product that have nothing to do with privacy. How good it makes calls, the apps, the functionality, everything. So it's really important from a competitive idea, building trust. And we have seen companies leverage the competitive aspect of this really well. Apple markets this very effectively. So it does really have that advantage and purpose that we need to look both the individual space and then the professional space. Next slide, please. Another way to think about privacy, we often think about it, at least in the professional context, as it's either high or low. It's good or bad. And I think this slide is really designed to challenge that concept, that oftentimes, instead of it being good or bad, we want to consider a lot of different factors. And it matters. What is the context? Who did you obtain the information from? Was there consent? How sensitive is that? Is it medical data, or is there how many paper clips someone bought? What were you able to communicate to the person? What security were you able to give? So instead of things just being high or low, you can kind of see off to the right, we're able to use this mixing board approach and create the best outcomes, both for the consumer, the business, and privacy by kind of evaluating these different areas. There are lots of different mitigations and solutions we can have. The next slide, please. All right, so getting into a brief history of privacy. Often the father of modern day privacy, at least in the US, is Justice Brandeis. He and his colleague Warren wrote a law review article, the Harvard Law Review, over 100 years ago, entitled "The Right to Privacy." But privacy has been a concern. It was a concern in our society even before that. And while the technology is constantly changing, we see the same issues come up over and over again. So I'm going to show you a couple headlines that are over a century old, but they really look like they could have been written today. And they talk about technology, all these new technologies at the time, destroying privacy. So the first one here, next slide, is from an Atlantic article, and it's talking about a new product that 200,000 were sold in 2 hours in New York, that people were lining up to buy them, but that people were just completely disregarding how it would expose their secrets, disregard to the consequences. How could people be so dumb? This is back in 1873. This was a reaction to the postcard. And the fear here was that a postal carrier, or anyone who might happen to see it, could see what you wrote to a friend, family member, or colleague, that what you were writing was no longer private. How could people be so stupid to share that kind of information out in the wild? The next slide shows an article from the New York Times in 1877, warning of a product that would certainly herald the immediate, I love it, it's the immediate end of privacy. And this was a reaction to the telephone. And I like this one because if you read the article, I don't know if you guys can see it, but it describes some things that could be describing Facebook and Instagram today, parts of the article. It talks about, while the intended purpose of the tool is an innocent one, without thinking, people are sharing untold secrets and announcing to the world when they're home and when they're out, and immediate end of the privacy. Privacy is dead. And then finally, my last example comes from the X-ray here. So again, this is a New York Times article in 1896. It claims that while the whole world was marveling at this new device, it signaled the era of privacy was at an end. Even things going inside your body were no longer safe from science, and this was going to kill off privacy. So going to the next slide, what's the takeaway from this? And I think what you can see is that people have always cared about privacy. And the past really helps us predict the future. I'll tell people I can predict the future in this very narrow area because we've seen it happen again and again. Privacy concerns arise when new technology changes information flows. What do I mean by that? I mean, when you're taking information from one person to a new entity, to a new group, to a government, to an organization, or between organizations, there's new flows of data that are occurring that we're not used to. And there are new expectations that we set around that may or may not be aligned with what the technology can do. Usually companies at technology make the mistake of not explaining what they're doing and how very well, so people kind of create their own stories, which usually kind of go awry. The best example I have of that is that my wife is convinced that Facebook is listening to her via her phone. I'm a privacy lawyer. I can tell her conclusively this is not happening, but you won't believe me because their ads are so good at targeting certain things that she wants. So because Facebook has not done an effective job of communicating how they're able to do that, people create their own stories about what's happening. One of the takeaways here is that while initial privacy fears are usually overblown, they are rooted in real priorities. They are rooted in something real and something people care about. And then privacy changes create real impacts on how people live. We really see that this can impact and affect vulnerable groups. And there's been a lot of studies about how vulnerable groups, especially low-income communities, are really at a deficit. They don't have the option to choose maybe more privacy-friendly options. So they're often, essentially selling their data, information about them, to receive these services. And that definitely puts them at different risk than other people are facing. Next slide, please. So what are some of the things that we care about in this new technology, in the automotive space, autonomous vehicle space? So one of my focuses is, and it can be a bit of a downer, what are the potential misuses for our technology? oftentimes privacy in the US is considered an individual's public movements to not be private. But what does it mean if between a car, a telephone, and other sources of data, you can combine all those movements? So essentially you have someone tracking you the whole time. What does that mean? What's that conclusion? How does that affect things? Are there going to be new rules about that? Do we need to think about that? We also have surveillance concerns. If we're out there in the world operating, collecting sensor data. Yeah. Did you lose me? No? Okay. If we're collecting sensor data, what are the surveillance concerns that we have about that? Is the technology we're creating potentially a tool for surveillance, especially if we move outside of what we consider Western democracies? Is that something we need to concern ourselves with? Do we need to think about that? What is a private space even anymore? If you have a taxi, but you take the driver out, is that still a taxi? Is that something you'd assume that someone's going to overhear your communications? Is that a private space? I often ask our engineers and our product folks, are we building a hotel room or are we building a taxi? Are we building a space that people would assume is private, or is it not private? And depending on what we communicate with people, how we market that, we set the expectations, will help define that space, because we really are creating a new space here. A car where you take the driver out, you're alone, someone else is driving. But also, who owns travel data? Who does this belong to? Is this a public right? Is this something utilities should own? The DMV, should they own some of this data, the driving data? So these are some of the themes that we have to think about that are a little novel, and they change. Again, we see those new flows of information and new expectations. These are some of the things we consider in this space. Next slide, please. So what this slide is talking about is we're looking at some of the real specific challenges, unique challenges we're talking about. And the first circle is talking about like data collection. We need to think about what are the sources, what are reasonable insights that we may have for the data, and really taking stock of what we're collecting and what do we need. That middle circle here, the one with the car and then the three concentric circles, this one shows a really unique aspect of AVs, because while a lot of technology is dealing with one-to-one consumer relationships, your Gmail account, you subscribe to it, Google can contact you and say, hey, we have this new feature, or hey, we like to use your data in this way. Is that okay? You can say yes or no. Our AVs are very different. We have people who are inside the car who use the service. So most of them are going to be guests or users of the technology. Those are similar to other technology users. We have a direct relationship with them. We can communicate with them. The next circle are people who are outside the vehicle, who our sensors may interact with, who we may come in contact with when we're driving or avoid. Those people may not have a direct relationship with us, but there still is some information flows coming from us to them in both ways. So how do we communicate with them? How does that context change how we should use that data? And then that third concentric circle are individuals and things that have a really indirect relationship with our technology. So that might be someone's property or a car speeding down the road. People who don't even recognize that our car is there, we may get some information out that's indirectly tied to them. So that's a very attenuated relationship. What are our responsibilities? What are the rules around that data? And then finally, the scope and baseline constraints. We really need to think very carefully around this idea of data minimization. What data we actually need, and then can synthetic data and ML data be used alternatively as opposed to using data about people? Next slide, please. So one of these is this is really reflecting the joy of my job, which is while I'm an attorney, my job is really to draw on a lot of different things, since the law is so far behind technology, especially in the privacy and security, digital security space. I really look at all of these different facets to kind of come up with and do my job in evaluating new products, how we communicate with users, and looking at our strategy. So of course we look at the law, but that's very varied. In the US, it's very patchworky. The laws in Arizona are very different from the laws in California, where I live, and those are very different than those in Massachusetts and Illinois. Civil and policy and civil rights. We need to look at the history of technology and how they affected groups over time. What is the policy? What's the world we want to create with this technology? We are in the transportation space. I often say we're not really a tech company, we're a transportation company that uses tech. What are the norms there? What are the expectations people have there? Again, thinking about when you're in a taxi, what are your expectations around privacy and what they're going to be collecting? And And then technology and science fiction. Part of my job is really to like live in modern day science fiction, but to think about where is the technology going tomorrow, in 5 years, in 2035, and to prepare us for that. It doesn't do much good if my solutions, the privacy constraints we have, work for only a couple of years. They need to work in the future. And then, of course, meeting the business objectives. How do we actually get the technology out there? How do we create a good solution for the consumer and the business?